Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to history class. Hope you had a good spring break. Hope you had a happy Easter. Even that was kind of a weird one with the whole not being in church thing. It's kind of strange, but I never thought I'd see the day. But nonetheless, hope everyone's good and recharged and doing well. Today we're going to dive into a little bit of Chinese history and the brief run of the Republic of China and the rise of the Chinese Communist. And hopefully y'all have not gotten too behind on your work and followed in the footsteps of me, who right now am beginning the first of probably 5 lectures that I have to film today at about 9 p.m. the day before they're due to you. So anyway, this college student schedule can get a little crazy if you don't have a little self-control. So anyway, hope everyone does a little bit better than I am about not procrastinating with your work. So anyway, today we're going to talk a little bit about, I think where we last left off with the Chinese, it was towards the end of the Qing Dynasty, which of course, you spell that with a Q, Q-I-N-G, the Qing Dynasty. And the Qing Dynasty had ruled China since the 1600s. But as we talked about last time we kind of hit that part of the world, they had not been especially prosperous towards the end there, because you had this period of a lot of imperial domination where European and to a lesser extent American governments were exerting an awful lot of influence. And you have things like the Opium War, where the British basically said, no, you can't stop us from selling Indian opium in your country, and if you try to stop us, we're going to go to war. And, so you have the extraterritoriality. Say it sometimes, extraterritoriality. There we go. Where they were not allowed to charge. Where any foreigners that were charged with a crime would be tried by their own countries and not by the Chinese government, which was a great surrender of sovereignty within their own borders. You have a war with Japan that they lose. You have the infamous Boxer Rebellion, where a lot of Chinese nationalists really wanted to drive out all the foreigners, as well as the Chinese Christians, who they looked at as national traitors for having betrayed the traditional Chinese beliefs for what they perceived as a Western religion. Of course, it came from the Middle East, but no one seems to get him any credit for that. But of course, America was one of several countries that sent some troops to help put down the Boxer Rebellion. But that same government that was dealing with all of that, is finally, after a couple hundred years of going steadily downhill, finally kind of collapses in the early 1910s. And you have a handful of people in China are looking to the example of Japan, which became really the first Asian country to really truly nationalize and industrialize. And so anyway, they said, well, why don't we kind of follow in those footsteps and try to move into the 20th century in a real way. And in addition, you had this real desire to kind of drive out foreign influence and reassert Chinese sovereignty. And so ultimately, the Qing Dynasty is overthrown right around 1912, and a brief Chinese Republic is established under the leadership of a man by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Now, again, Chinese is a pictorial language that uses a lot of characters that doesn't use the same alphabet that we use. So there's a couple different systems that have been put in place for transliterating those Chinese characters into our alphabet. There was a change from one system to another that happened around the time, I want to say it was around the 1980s. But because of that, most of the figures from this period of time are kind of known by multiple names. This is because their names were transliterated slightly different. So your book's going to spell some of these a little bit different than I'm going to pronounce them. I'm kind of sticking with pronunciations that I learned in school. Although the ones in the book, I guess, a little technically more up to date in some ways. But it's just hard for me not to call these people Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and Sun Yat-sen, because I've been doing it my whole life. So we'll roll with that for right now. But there's a couple different alternatives of how you can pronounce them. But anyway, so Sun Yat-sen becomes the first president of the Republic of China, and he's kind of got a three-pronged platform. The first thing is nationalism. He wanted to drive out foreign influence, but also to unite various regions of China that had regionalistic identification, and kind of centralize things with us, and try to make them into more of one society under one government. Secondarily, modernization and a move toward more kind of democratic ideas. So Sun Yat-sen is kind of wanting to move China into democracy, but he's not going to be extraordinarily successful in doing that, because the Republic of China is going to be relatively short-lived. And the third thing was increasing economic vitality, and trying to do more to care for the material condition of the Chinese people. Ultimately, though, Sun Yat-sen is not able to really get a firm control over the land in China, and he winds up having to pass the presidency along to a general by the name of Yuan Shikai. And Yuan Shikai, kind of is more of a military leader than anything else. And so he's not really pushing for democracy. He's kind of more of a military dictator type individual. He dies in 1916, and this is going to lead to war breaking out. And China kind of devolves into just realized I'd left that open and giving you a view of my bathroom. I don't know if anyone wanted to see that. So anyway, Yuan Shikai dies, and when that happens, you have this situation where from there, China kind of devolves into these different pockets that are controlled by different warlords. And these different military leaders kind of take control of like little regions within China. There's no real strong Chinese government, and so everything is decentralized. And then China's discontent gets worse because what was left of the central government had committed a few troops to involvement in World War I on the side of the Allies, because Germany had taken some Chinese territory, and they thought that maybe if they pitched in the war, that when the Germans lost, which they thought that was going to happen, that they might get that land back. Well, the Allies signed the Treaty of Versailles, and they actually give those lands to Japan, who also fought on the Allies' side in that war. And so that really irritated a lot of people in China, spurred a mass protest movement known as the May 4th movement, where people kind of revolted against the Treaty of Versailles, which they considered to be unfair. And ironic thing, the physical place where the May 4th protest really began is actually a place in Beijing, the capital city, called Tiananmen Square, which you may be too young to know, but you might be aware of. Tiananmen Square was the site of a major insurrection against the Communist Party of China in 1989, when I was but a wee lad. And in that case, the Chinese communists responded with brutality and murdered a lot of pro-democracy protesters, brought in tanks and the whole deal. The Chinese Communist Party, a bad deal, and I'm really ticked off at them right now too, because there's thousands of people dead because they wouldn't, tell anyone about what's going on right now. But so not a big fan of the Chinese Communist ever, but certainly not right now. But anyway, so ironically, the May 4th movement kind of turns public opinion away from the Western democracies, because they think the Western democracies have kind of treated them unfairly with the treaty, and it makes people more sympathetic to paying attention to the ideology that is emerging in Russia and the Soviet Union at this time. And so ultimately, you do have the establishment of the first Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of a man named Mao Zedong, who is probably more responsible for more deaths than probably any man who's ever lived statistically. I've seen some estimates upwards of 50 million. If you count some of the engineered famines and some of the Chinese military ventures, all these different things, as well as the intentional persecution of dissidents, Mao Zedong results in tens of millions of people dead. Truly atrocious man, and truly atrocious acts that he commits. But Mao winds up kind of befriending Leninist Russia to a certain extent. He develops kind of his own brand of communism that's a little bit more geared toward Chinese culture. So whereas typically communism was oriented around the needs of, German industrial workers, which is what Marx knew when he wrote, he created kind of a version of communism that was a little more oriented around the perceived needs of agrarian and rural society, because China was predominantly, a farming society at this point in time. And so it's a little bit more of a ruralized version of Marxist-Leninism. But he starts this Chinese Communist Party, begins agitating, and then the leadership of the Chinese Nationalist Party that had been the party of Sun Yat-sen, they were known as the Kuomintang. And the Kuomintang comes under the control of a general by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was a military figure. If I recall correct, I think he had married into a Christian family. And he comes in kind of promising to restore the vision of democratic China of Sun Yat-sen, but he doesn't really follow through. In fact, his government winds up being pretty inefficient and often corrupt. In fact, when they and the communists are going to go to civil war here in a couple minutes, there's accounts during that war of Chiang Kai-shek's where'd that come from? This is why you don't start your lectures at 9 p.m., kids. Chiang Kai-shek, actually, there's accounts of the Nationalist Chinese Army of the artillery units actually like charging infantry units for their services to protect them in the battles. So just a lot of graft and money changing hands, and it was not the greatest government in the world. However, it was still preferable to the opposition, which was Mao, who winds up being one of the most vicious of all these various totalitarian dictators. The 20th century is just filled with these vicious, mass-murdering totalitarians between Hitler and Stalin and Lenin and Mao and Idi Amin and Mussolini and Pol Pot and Saddam Hussein. I mean, it's just... there's just so many bad guys came to power in the 20th century. It's really Fidel Castro, Kim Jong Il, and Kim Il Sung. So anyway, the Kuomintang are the good guys by default. I mean, neither side's really a great government that you'd love to vote for, but matter of perspective. And ultimately, Chiang Kai-shek is going to assume the presidency of the Republic of China for what it's worth. But again, he doesn't have entirely strong control over the whole of the nation at this point in time. Meanwhile, at some point around 1828, the political situation has devolved into civil war between the nationalists, who were at least talking about democracy with their mouths, even if they weren't really doing it, and then the communist. And the communist, by then, had gotten a pretty good PR game going. Actually convinced a lot of the villagers that they were on their side. One thing they would do is that when the communist armies would gain control of an area, they would start dividing up the land amongst the farmers and stuff like that. So they got a lot of peasants actually kind of on their side. But the Civil War starts off going very badly for the communists. The Kuomintang winds up taking out a lot of leaders. They start executing a lot of the communist leaders in the streets, which really enrage the communists in China and across the world. But they wind up ultimately the communists were nearly wiped out. And then it is at that time that Mao adopted a strategy of moving the revolution into the countryside. And he called it swimming in the peasant sea, because a lot of the peasants were more sympathetic to him. And so he moved the battle away from the urban areas where you had a little bit of a middle class and nobility that were more sympathetic to Shang. We took them out into the countryside where people were more in favor of Mao. Excuse me. And ultimately leads them on what they call the Long March, which is, as the name implies, a very long march, where they fled, the last remaining core of the communist unit fled tremendous distances from the national government. I'll go ahead and grab your textbook here to look at the statistics. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you had... so it was 6,000 miles, which was the equivalent of going a round trip from New York to San Francisco and back. The communists crossed 18 mountain ranges and 24 rivers over this year-long flight. So they're kind of on the run for about a year. And the process of that, they crossed 24 rivers, go across 18 mountain ranges. They would sleep sitting up, leaning back to back in pairs so that they wouldn't sink into the mud. There's this one very famous scene where they have to cross a bridge with iron chains. His planks had been removed, and they've got to kind of keep walking on the chains, and you can't fall between them. You see the picture of it there in your textbook. And so for 1934 and 35, this is kind of how the war's going. You've got 100,000 communists against 700,000 nationalists. The communists on the run for their lives. And then, funny thing happens. The Japanese show up. And this is actually the beginning of World War II. There's, if you ask most people, when does World War II get started? You'll say, 1939 when Hitler invaded and the Germans invade Poland. But that's, from an Asian perspective, that's not true. From an Asian perspective, World War II begins in 1937 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which is a region of northern China. And so the Japanese invade, and now everyone kind of has to team up a little bit in order to prevent Japan from taking everything over. So they've been fighting for more or less a decade at this point. The Japanese show up. They have to sign kind of an uneasy ceasefire where both sides agree to stop fighting each other to fight the Japanese. But because there was so much disunity between them, they wouldn't organize together or put their troops under common command or anything like that. So you've basically got two different Chinese armies fighting the Japanese. Mao, too, was really an expert at maneuvering the Red Army in places to make sure that Shang had to bear the brunt of a lot of the fighting with the Japanese. So ultimately, the poor Chinese people, it's been a rough 100 years, because you have this brief period of time where you think it's going to be a republic. That degenerates, and then you get this 10 years of civil war between communists and Kuomintang. Then there's kind of this, not quite, probably 7-8 years of ceasefire where they're fighting the Japanese from 37 until 45. Then in 1945, as soon as the Japanese surrender, the Civil War is back on. They start fighting again. It's ultimately going to lead to the communists taking over all of China except the island of Taiwan, right around, the late 1940s. As a matter of fact, the current nation of Taiwan is descended from the Kuomintang. The nationalist government of China under Chiang Kai-shek, literally, they fled the mainland and went to that island. At the time it was called Formosa, and set up what people usually call Taiwan for short. They literally call themselves the Republic of China. And it's literally still the case that the Republic of China, or Taiwan, claims to be the rightful government over the whole land of China, and the Communist Party refuses to recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan. They claim that they're still a Chinese province. And you may have seen this come up in the news recently where, a World Health Organization official is being asked questions by a reporter who I think was Taiwanese about Taiwan's response to coronavirus, and he literally, because he didn't want to offend the Chinese Communist Party, literally refused to answer the question or acknowledge that Taiwan existed or that Taiwan did a better job of responding to the virus. So, like, literally shut down the interview. That's how much the communist Chinese hate the existence of Taiwan. And don't want anyone to even recognize it as a real nation. And in fact, they got Taiwan, who's a relative democracy, kicked out of the United Nations to where only the communist China is recognized in that organization. So, nonetheless, America continues to be an ally of the Taiwanese. So, so some of the geopolitical stuff that's been going on for these last decades dates back to this time period here in the 1930s and 40s. So, I got distracted, but, the poor Chinese, you have all these things happen. And then when the Civil War is over, the communists won. And it's been a very brutal government that's killed tens of millions of people. And right now there's, horrendous atrocities being done by the Chinese government. There's a group of people known as the Uyghurs who are a Turkish people in the, I think it's the northwestern part of China, if I'm not mistaken. That's off the top of my head. But they're Muslim. And the Chinese government didn't like them being around, and literally has started concentration camps, and they're literally taking Uyghur women away from their husbands and forcing them to intermarry with the Han Chinese population so that the Uyghurs cease to exist as a people group. They've been persecuting the Chinese Christians for decades, as well as some of the Tibetan Buddhists as well. Anyone who advocates for democracy or anything like that runs a really good chance of being disappeared or sent to some sort of political prison or whatever. So, communism in China, not a good thing. Just like communism in Russia isn't a good thing. Communism in Cuba, we'll see, is no good thing. North Korea, not a good thing. Communism is bad, children. It's just, if you learn nothing from this class, please learn to hate communism. So anyway, with that, we will take a short break, and we'll come back to tell you a little bit about what's going on in some other parts of Asia.